Right, good morning everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on the opening day of the WCX19, and we've got here for the second year running Mobility History's The History of the Future. We are the committee which brings these cars together, and the theme this year is propulsion. So not surprising that we're starting with steam, and as an avid steam locomotive fan myself for many years, I'm happy to launch this little interview here.
Well, we're here in front of the Stanley Steamer. This is a Stanley Model 63 from 1912, and this is here to represent the steam cars of the past. And steam was a major technology in the early development of vehicles. So in 1900, 40% of all vehicles were steam cars, 38% were electric, and just 22% were internal combustion engine or other. So steam was huge in the early days of automotive, and it goes back quite a ways. The earliest known steam car idea was a toy car in 1672 that was designed by Ferdinand Verbius. He was a Flemish missionary. So the earliest steam vehicle that we know was built was designed and built by a Frenchman whose name was Nicolas Joseph Suguenot. This car was created in 1769. And he made it for the French military so that they could move armaments. It wasn't a passenger vehicle, but he did not have the use of high-pressure steam. High-pressure steam didn't come into use, or that technique was not developed until 1800. So from 1800 on, there was a massive flourishing of ideas around transportation using steam as your power technology. And they got better and better. By the 1830s, they were actually using steam carriages to transport people between cities in the UK. Steam was flourishing as a technology for tinkerers in France, in the United States. So it was a very big deal. And as I said, by 1900, 40% of all vehicles on the road were steam. So we're standing here in front of the Model T Ford. This is a 1915 Model T, and this is here to represent the massive change in the automotive industry that led to the dominance of the internal combustion engine. And that massive change actually started in 1901 with the discovery of oil at Spindletop, which is outside of Beaumont, Texas. And the amount of oil they discovered at Spindletop changed the game for oil as a fuel. So prior to Spindletop, oil was very expensive. It wasn't usable as a fuel because of the cost. After Spindletop, the price came down considerably, and all of a sudden you could burn it for almost anything. In addition to Spindletop, another thing that helped the dominance of the internal combustion engine is the development of the electric starter. Now, the electric starter was developed actually several times over the course of many years, but the true electric starter development was from Henry Leland and Charles Kettering through the Cadillac Company. And so the first electric starter was on the 1912 Cadillac Model 30. The reason that the electric starter was developed in that period was that Henry Leland, the owner of the Cadillac Company, had a friend who had died in a freak cranking accident over on Belle Isle, which is just here in the city of Detroit. And he'd been driving around Belle Isle, he saw a stranded motorist, he decided to help her crank her car, and the crank kicked back at him, broke his jaw, and he died of complications from the broken jaw. And it wasn't just the fact that his friend had died that really bothered Leland, it was the fact that his friend was killed by a Cadillac that also troubled him. And he decided that at that point, he couldn't allow a Cadillac to kill another person. And so he set his engineers to working on the electric starter. They built one, but it was too big to put in a car. So that's when he brought in his friend Charles Kettering, and together they managed to make an electric starter that could fit inside an automobile, and that starter was released on the Cadillac Model 30, which came out in 1912. So then the third component of the dominance of the internal combustion engine is the Model T Ford, which is why this is here behind me. And the Model T is the first car that was produced on the moving assembly line. So in 1913, Henry Ford and his engineers tried to figure out how they could produce a car more efficiently. They drew inspiration from a number of different sources, including the meat packing industry, local general stores that were high efficiency, and they came up with a way of moving the car along the assembly line, so the car was constantly in motion as it was being put together, and it even rolled down a chute at the end onto the street level to continue out to be sold. And this allowed them to raise the production of the car and lower the car's cost considerably. So in 1913, they actually produced 170,000 Model Ts, and they were able to get the cost down to $525, I believe, which is has a modern day equivalency of about $13,000. The next year, they produced over 200,000 cars, got the cost down to $440, and so it went sort of down the line. And what ended up happening was that middle class people could suddenly own a car. Prior to this, it was really the area for the rich. They wouldn't be able to afford one, but now all of a sudden they could afford one. It cost less than a year's salary, so they were able to get that. So behind me, you will see the Ricardo engine. This is the E6 test engine, single-cylinder engine. This engine and earlier iterations of this engine were used to test anti-knock properties in fuel. The reason for this is because Harry Ricardo was actually the one to discover and or name the knocking issue that some fuels created, or some fuel compositions created in the engine. Now, he discovered this in aircraft engines, and this was something that he then went on to test during the World War I period, or just after. So he was testing this from 1916 to 1919, and that was in his original engine, test engine. This is actually the third iteration of these test engines, and for more advanced testing of fuel compositions. You have the Detroit Electric. This is from 1912. And this car is on display because it represents a little bit after the heyday of the electric car. The heyday of the electric car was actually in 1900, and at that point, 38% of all vehicles in the United States were electric cars. It's probably not a huge amount of cars, but it was pretty significant when you compare it to the 22% that were internal combustion engine cars. So the development of the electric car goes all the way back to the 1830s with the development of the electric motor. Now, this was developed by a blacksmith named Thomas Davenport. He was from Vermont, and he was, out trying to get out to buy raw materials for his smithy when he saw a powerful electric magnet lift up a blacksmith anvil, and he was so taken by the electromagnet that he forgot about blacksmithing altogether. He sold his horse and buggy so that he could buy this electromagnet and take it home. Not quite sure how he got it home, but he did. And he spent the rest of his life working on projects that had to do with electricity. He unfortunately died penniless. His technology never came to anything because battery technology wasn't there at the time. That took a lot longer. So there were two major developments, one in the 1860s when they developed the first storage battery, and then one in 1881, another development that made that storage battery more viable. And so by 1881, there were actually electric vehicles on the road. The first two electric vehicles were actually in France, and there were more electric vehicles that followed thereafter until they became a more viable vehicle option in around the 1890s. So here you have it, the electric car.
Morning, Steve. I'm here today at the SAE International with this 1916 Detroit Electric, which was updated in 1928, but is still considered a 1916. The electrics were extremely popular in most cities. In fact, prior to about 1918, there were more electrics in the big cities than there were gasoline cars. This particular car I bought as a one-owner used car. It lived in Ann Arbor in 1982, and we got it functional again. It was at the time the wheels wobbled, the paint was peeling, mice had been in the upholstery. It had all the characteristics of an old car that hadn't gone anywhere for a while. The last that had been run was in 1944 during the gas rationing during the war, and they put a set of batteries in it made by Gould Cathanode, who made submarine batteries at that time, but they would make batteries for the early electrics, and so they were able to get batteries and then drove the car during gas rationing period. Then the car went into storage and prior to my having it, and so it needed an awful lot of work after I got it. But we did get it running, and then decided in 2000 to restore it. And that was what was going to be a one-year project turned into over a 3-year project, really. And now we have what you see here. It's a restored early electric. The early electrics were driven mainly by women. The ads in the Saturday Evening Post generally showed women getting into the cars because they were so clean and so quiet. There was also another model with the B body that was a little shorter that a lot of people called a doctor coupe. Doctors loved them because they could go see their patients and arrive clean and quiet and not smelly because they didn't have to crank a gasoline engine or be outside. They could. It was a very civil sort of vehicle in that sense, in that you were in an enclosed vehicle, which most of the other gasoline cars were open at that time. There were some closed ones, but the bulk of them were open cars. So we have this car here as part of a display. On the one side of the entrance to the SAE here is this car representing the early part. On the other side of the entrance is a Tesla. And so the intent here is to show that what goes around comes around, however you want to say it. A lot of people are not aware that they were the early electrics that were sophisticated to this degree as a fine car. They were expensive. These cars were maybe $2,500 when you could buy a Model T for $400, $500. So they were owned by the rich.
So behind me you see the Chrysler turbine car. It's from 1963, and this car is here to represent turbine technology. Now, this comes out of a period during and after World War II when turbine engines were being tested as a possible power source for cars. This was something that was being used for airplanes, and actually the original, in terms of the Allied side's forays into the turbine engine for airplanes, that was actually developed by a car company. It was developed by Rover over in England at the behest of the British government. And they developed it because Rolls, which did actually develop aircraft engines at the time, had turned them down. They were too busy. So Rover developed, over the course of a number of years, a functional turbine engine for aircrafts. They were able to get this to work in the air, and they labeled it the B-26. They sold the resulting engine to Rolls. Rolls renamed it the Welland, and it was the first production turbine aircraft engine. But Rover didn't want to let the idea go. They liked this idea of turbine engines, and they thought they could work in cars. So Rover continued development into car engines, turbine car engines, and by 1950 they actually had a functional turbine car. They weren't the only company to work with turbine technology. Another company is the one represented behind me here, Chrysler.
This beautiful Chrysler turbine car from 1963-64 was really the culmination of a program that had begun at Chrysler Corporation right after World War II under the stewardship of the great engineer George Huebner. The Chrysler turbine car project was his baby nearly all the way through. The first car that had a turbine engine developed by Chrysler was a 1954 Plymouth. Huebner did one, and it was shown and driven around the country. There were several generations of turbine cars following that, including a 1962 Dodge and a 1962 Plymouth that were equipped and shown at dealerships around the country. After a series of demonstration programs using Plymouth and Dodge vehicles with turbine engines, Chrysler Corporation undertook a very specific turbine car program that would reflect unique styling and features, with the thought that this vehicle would show how the car was viable and applicable for transportation in the 1960s and beyond. And by this time, Elwood Engel had become the chief of Chrysler Styling. And under his stewardship and with the craftsmanship of Ghia in Italy, these beautiful Chrysler turbine coupes were developed. 50 of them were ultimately built and put in the hands of not company executives, but regular motorists and families to experience over a period of time and to evaluate. This car had very specific styling for this program, and in fact, there was a wonderful convertible version that was prepared and shown at the Chrysler display at the 1964 and 65 New York World's Fair. The program continued after these coupes were built in 1964, and then culminated in probably the last official showing of a Chrysler turbine car in 1976, based on the Volare and Aspen models of that time, shown around the industry. Shortly after that time, the program was ended. The program was ended for a couple of reasons. Of course, in the fall of 1973, specifically in October 1973, we had the first oil embargo, and that was a factor in consideration for Chrysler turbine program development. And then also, too, parallel to that, and beginning in the late 1960s, we had a push for emissions and clean air that came along and affected turbine car development. Frankly, also, too, the costs of building a turbine engine were another factor that, when viewed in the entire mix of alternatives, mitigated against further development of the turbine car for mass production.
There were a number of other companies that also were working with turbine technology, most notably General Motors. They also built a series of turbine cars back in the 1950s. Their cars took a completely different angle on the idea of turbine technology. The GM cars were more like airplanes without wings. The idea was speed, the idea was future. The Firebird 2, which was their second turbine vehicle, was actually an autonomous concept. So they were looking towards the more distant future, whereas Chrysler was looking at the car of the near future, the immediate future. So it's a very different take on the idea. Both companies were, obviously, as I said, worked on turbine engines for a while, but eventually the technology petered out a bit.
Steve, we have at the Mobility History stand at SAE this year a fabulous example of a Mazda RX7 sports coupe. In fact, this particular RX7 set speed records on the Bonneville Salt Flats, and I hope that our owner, Don Sherman, will be able to explain more about that part of the car's history. But how did Mazda get the Wankel engine? How did the RX7 get the Wankel rotary engine? The engine was developed by Dr. Felix Wankel in Germany in the 1950s and was featured by the German brand NSU, perhaps more famous for its motorcycles, later folded into Audi, and which became part of the Volkswagen Group. But in the late 1950s, NSU saw the Wankel engine as a potential opportunity to build its passenger car portfolio. And so they added the Wankel engine to a version of their Sport Prinz coupe, which was a beautiful Bertone designed coupe, and called it the Sport Prinz Spider. And it was actually, in its Wankel form, a convertible, and actually built and sold that for a few years. At about the same time, the Wankel engine technology was licensed to Toyo Kogyo of Japan, the company that built Mazda, the Mazda automobile brand. That's what Mazda was called at that time, Toyo Kogyo. And they developed their own Wankel engine, rotary engine program, and built on that, showing in 1967 their first rotary engine car, the Mazda Cosmo. They later added the rotary engine to a series of passenger car lines, primarily the RX2 and the RX3, which we had in our market in the early 1970s. The Wankel engine was famous for performance. It has very few moving parts and was loved by its owners and drivers. But again, October 1973, the first oil embargo brought to light a feature of the rotary engine that was not as helpful in the marketplace, and that is fuel economy, which wasn't as good. So Mazda, realizing this, decided that the real and best platform for the rotary engine would be sports cars. And so their RX7 was the first Mazda sports car to feature this engine here in the United States market in the 1980s. And this is an example of the first generation Mazda RX7.
My name is Don Sherman. I'm the proud owner of this 1979 Mazda RX-7. This is the first gen of this sports car. It wasn't the first use of the rotary, but it was probably the most successful one. I went to the car's launch in Japan. I tested a bunch of sports cars against it with Car and Driver, and I quickly became convinced that I needed to own one of these. So I bought one in Southern California, brand new, drove it back to Michigan. It was on the road for one winter only. It's got 22,000 miles now. It's highly modified. It was a project car called Tech Director's Toy for Car and Driver magazine and made the cover. The modifications include a larger 13B engine, stripping of emission controls, putting on a bunch of racing beat parts, such as the Holley carburetor, intake manifold, header, different ignition system. It's got weight removal. It's got a special lowered front suspension design. It's got fiberglass front bumper from the racing parts department, factory spoilers. It has none of the original brake parts, not even the brake pedal is factory, because the brakes were very anemic. This car only had 100 horsepower to start with, and my edition has 150, so I needed much more brakes. It's got larger front rotors. It's got a switch from drums to discs and back. It's got a balance bar instead of any form of booster. The one component left is it does use factory front calipers, but the brake system's been reliable and much more effective than the factory gear. Interior, it's got heated Recaro seats with pigskin and velour upholstery. It's got a new console design, completely different sound system and a center instrument panel layout. It's got a Nardi steering wheel. So this is, it even has mirrors removed from a Dodge Colt that I put on. So it's very different, but it's still got the core essence of an RX-7. And I've thoroughly enjoyed owning it, driving it. I've got a long relationship with RX-7s. I set speed records at Bonneville Salt Flats with two of them. In 78, one went 180. In 86, a later series with turbocharging set a record at 234 miles an hour. I was also lucky enough to drive in the 24 Hours of Daytona in 1979 with Racing Beat. That car broke at 17 hours, but it was quite an interesting experience. So I've had far more than my share of fun with RX-7s throughout my life.
So here we are in front of the Tesla Model S. This car is on our display because Tesla represents a resurgence of electric cars. Now, the Tesla company was founded in 2003, sort of as a direct response to the decommissioning of the EV1. The EV1 was an electric car by GM that came out in the late 90s, was decommissioned by the early 2000s. And the Tesla founders looked at this and they felt that electric is a viable way to power a vehicle. And now all of a sudden there's a vacuum in the market. someone should build an electric car. Why not us? So they founded the company in 2003. By 2008, they had developed their first car. It was a Tesla Roadster. And in the time period shortly thereafter, they managed to push through that barrier and make electric a viable car to own. It's not to say that the Tesla is the most popular electric car. That actually belongs to the Nissan Leaf. But it is the car that made owning an electric car realistic. And it is the car that sort of made it popular again. So we're standing here in front of the Toyota Prius. This is a 2019. Beautiful color, by the way. And this car is here to represent hybrid technology. The hybrid technology came back after the Clean Air Acts went into effect. The governments of various countries, not just the United States, were looking for a way to combat mobile sources of pollution. And so one of the many technologies that were explored by auto companies during this time was hybrid technology. And there were a number of experimental vehicles that were created to showcase hybrid technology. But the Prius is here because the Prius is the car that made hybrid technology realistic. It's the car that actually broke through that barrier of experimental technology and brought it into the mainstream so people could truly envision owning a hybrid car. And so here you go. The Toyota Prius.